In the deepest hollows of the Appalachian Mountains, where civilization's grip grows tenuous and the forest's ancient whispers still carry weight, there are stories that respectable historians refuse to tell. These are tales so dark, so fundamentally disturbing to human sensibilities, that they have been systematically erased from official records, relegated to whispered oral traditions that survive only in the most isolated communities. Among these forbidden chapters of American history, perhaps none is more chilling than the case of the man known only as the Butcher of Blackwood Creek, whose reign of terror in the 1890s was so horrific that an entire region conspired to forget his very existence. The hollow known as Blackwood Creek carved its way through the mountains of eastern Kentucky, like a wound that never healed, its dark waters running between walls of limestone that rose so steep and close that sunlight touched the creek bed for only a few hours each day. It was here in this isolated valley where families had lived for generations without seeing outsiders for months at a time, that one man's descent into madness would create a legacy of horror so profound that it would poison the very soil where his crimes were committed. The first disappearance was noted in the autumn of 1891, when old Martha Hensley failed to return from her weekly walk to gather medicinal herbs along the creek banks. Martha had been making that same journey for 40 years, following paths she could navigate blindfolded, and her absence sent ripples of concern through the scattered homesteads that comprised the hollow's entire population. When search parties found nothing but her gathering basket sitting beside the water, its contents spilled, as if she had dropped it in sudden fright, the community attributed her vanishing to any number of natural hazards that claimed lives in the mountains. A fall into the creek during sudden flooding, an encounter with a bear, or simply the misfortune of an aging woman who had finally pushed her luck too far. But Martha Hensley's disappearance was only the beginning of a pattern that would ultimately claim 17 lives over the course of 3 years, each vanishing more disturbing than the last, each discovery more horrific than the previous, until the very name of Blackwood Creek became synonymous with an evil so profound that maps were redrawn to exclude it from geographical records. The man responsible for this systematic destruction of human life was known to his neighbors as Ezekiel Kane, though even this name may have been an alias adopted to conceal his true identity. Kane had arrived in the hollow sometime in early 1891, claiming to be a traveling preacher, seeking a place to establish a small congregation among the scattered families who rarely saw organized religion. His appearance was unremarkable, a tall, lean man in his 40s with graying hair and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of too much solitude. But his manner of speaking and his knowledge of scripture impressed the deeply religious mountain families who welcomed him into their community. What they could not have known was that Ezekiel Kane harbored appetites and compulsions that placed him far beyond the boundaries of human decency, desires that had been nurtured and refined through years of careful experimentation on victims whose disappearances had never been connected to his name. Blackwood Creek represented not his first hunting ground, but his masterpiece, an isolated laboratory where he could perfect techniques that had been developed through a decade of carefully concealed atrocities. The true horror of Kane's methods would not become clear until much later, when investigators who possessed stronger stomachs than most began to piece together evidence that revealed the systematic nature of his crimes. Unlike the random violence of typical killers, Kane's activities followed patterns that suggested careful planning and methodical execution, as if each victim served a specific purpose in some larger design that existed only in his twisted imagination. Martha Hensley's fate, when it was finally discovered, provided the first glimpse into the depths of Kane's depravity. Her remains were found months later in a carefully constructed hiding place that revealed the killer's intimate knowledge of anatomy and his willingness to spend considerable time and effort in the preparation of his victims. The condition of her body suggested that death had not come quickly or mercifully, but rather through procedures that seemed designed to maximize suffering while preserving consciousness for as long as possible. But it was the evidence of what had been done to Martha after her death that truly revealed the monster that walked among the people of Blackwood Creek. Her body had been systematically dismembered with surgical precision, the pieces arranged in patterns that suggested ritual significance, while certain organs had been removed and preserved through methods that indicated both knowledge of anatomy and access to specialized equipment that should not have existed in such an isolated location. The discovery of Martha's remains coincided with the disappearance of the Morrison twins, 8-year-old boys, who had vanished while playing near the creek on a bright October afternoon. Their mother's frantic search had lasted for days, with every able-bodied person in the hollow joining the effort to locate the children before winter set in. But when their bodies were finally found, hidden in a cave system that few locals even knew existed, the sight that greeted the searchers was so horrific that several men collapsed and had to be carried away. The Morrison twins had suffered the same meticulous treatment as Martha Hensley, but with additional refinements that suggested Kane's techniques were evolving with each crime. The boys had been kept alive for an extended period, subjected to procedures that seemed designed to explore the limits of human endurance, while their final preparations followed patterns that indicated the killer was developing increasingly elaborate rituals around his victims' deaths. Most disturbing was the evidence that the children had been forced to participate in their own torment, compelled through methods that investigators could not fully understand to assist in procedures that ultimately led to their destruction. The psychological manipulation required to achieve such cooperation suggested a level of calculated cruelty that transcended simple sadism and approached the realm of systematic evil. As we delve into these territories where human behavior descends to depths that challenge our faith in humanity itself, we must ask ourselves how such monsters can exist among us undetected. The story we're exploring forces us to confront the darkest possibilities of human nature and the terrible prices paid by those who encounter evil in its purest form. If you find yourself drawn to these investigations into the shadows that history prefers to forget, please share your thoughts in the comments below and join our community by subscribing to the channel. The pattern of disappearances continued through the winter of 1891 and into the following spring, with each new victim providing Kane with opportunities to refine his methods and explore new territories of cruelty. Samuel Brewster, a middle-aged farmer known for his physical strength and independent nature, vanished in January while checking his trap lines. When his body was discovered weeks later, it bore evidence of restraint and torture that indicated he had been held captive for an extended period, subjected to procedures that seemed designed to break his will and reduce him to complete helplessness before his eventual death. The killer's choice of victims seemed to follow no logical pattern that would have allowed the community to predict who might be next. Children and adults, men and women, the strong and the frail, all were equally vulnerable to Kane's predations. This randomness created an atmosphere of terror that paralyzed the entire hollow, transforming a community that had once been characterized by trust and mutual support into a collection of suspicious, fearful individuals who no longer dared to venture out alone. But beneath the apparent randomness of victim selection, investigators would later identify subtle patterns that revealed the killer's methodology. Kane seemed to target individuals who possessed specific physical or psychological characteristics that served his experimental purposes, selecting victims whose disappearance would create maximum disruption to community cohesion while providing him with subjects suited to particular aspects of his research. The term research is used deliberately here, for the evidence recovered from Kane's activities suggested that his crimes were motivated not by simple bloodlust or random violence, but by a systematic attempt to explore human physical and psychological limits through direct experimentation. His victims were not merely killed but studied, their responses to various stimuli carefully documented in records that revealed a mind that approached torture and murder with scientific detachment. These records, discovered much later in hiding places throughout the hollow, provided insights into Kane's psychology that were so disturbing that most investigators refused to study them in detail. Written in a careful hand and organized with methodical precision, they documented experiments in pain tolerance, psychological manipulation, and physiological response that read like academic papers authored by someone whose field of study was human suffering. The spring of 1892 brought new horrors as Kane's confidence grew and his methods became more elaborate. The disappearance of the entire Fletcher family, parents and 3 young children, marked an escalation in both the scope and brutality of his crimes. Unlike previous victims who had vanished individually, the Fletchers were taken together, apparently from their own home during the night, with no signs of struggle or resistance that might have alerted neighbors to their fate. When the family's remains were eventually discovered, the scene that investigators encountered defied description through conventional language. The Fletchers had been arranged in a tableau that suggested they had been forced to participate in their own destruction, positioned in ways that indicated they had been compelled to witness each other's suffering before succumbing to their own fate. The killer had apparently spent days or weeks with his captives, using the bonds between family members as instruments of psychological torture that amplified the physical torment he inflicted. Children had been forced to watch their parents' degradation, while parents had been compelled to participate in procedures inflicted upon their offspring. The psychological manipulation required to achieve such cooperation revealed an understanding of human nature that was both profound and utterly malevolent, suggesting that Cain possessed insights into the human psyche that he had learned to weaponize with devastating effectiveness. The discovery of the Fletcher family's fate marked the point at which the community of Blackwood Creek began to understand that they were not dealing with conventional criminal activity, but with something that transcended normal categories of human evil. The systematic nature of the crimes, the evidence of careful planning and methodical execution, and most disturbing of all, the apparent pleasure that the killer derived from psychological as well as physical torment, indicated that they faced a predator whose motivations and capabilities placed him beyond their ability to comprehend or combat. The isolation that had once been the Hollow's greatest protection now became its most dangerous vulnerability. With no law enforcement within 100 miles and communication with the outside world limited to infrequent visits by traveling merchants, the community found itself trapped with a monster who knew their territory better than they did and who possessed knowledge and equipment that enabled him to operate with virtual impunity. Attempts to organize collective defense proved futile, as Cain seemed to anticipate every effort to trap or confront him. Guards posted to watch for his approach would disappear during their vigils, while traps set along the paths he was believed to use would be found dismantled and rearranged in patterns that seemed designed to mock the community's helplessness. Most disturbing were the messages that began appearing in locations where victims had been found. Cryptic communications written in what appeared to be blood that suggested the killer was not only aware of the community's efforts to stop him, but was actively enjoying their terror and desperation. The summer of 1892 saw the disappearance of 7 more individuals, each vanishing under circumstances that demonstrated Cain's growing boldness and the refinement of his techniques. Victims were taken in broad daylight from locations that should have been secure, snatched away in moments when their absence would not be noticed until it was too late to track their disappearance. The speed and efficiency of these abductions suggested that the killer had developed methods of subduing victims that left no opportunity for resistance or escape. Dr. Marcus Webb, a traveling physician who arrived in the Hollow during this period, provided the first professional assessment of the crimes and their perpetrator. Dr. Webb had served as a military surgeon during the Civil War and had witnessed the aftermath of some of humanity's most destructive impulses, but the evidence he encountered at Blackwood Creek challenged his understanding of what human beings were capable of inflicting upon one another. The individual responsible for these atrocities possesses knowledge of human anatomy that rivals that of trained physicians, combined with a psychological understanding that enables him to manipulate his victims in ways that maximize their suffering while preserving their consciousness for extended periods, Dr. Webb wrote in his report to state authorities. The systematic nature of these crimes suggests not random violence but carefully planned experimentation that treats human beings as laboratory specimens. The perpetrator appears to be conducting research into the limits of human endurance, using methods that represent a perversion of medical knowledge for purposes that no civilized person could contemplate. Dr. Webb's examination of crime scenes revealed evidence of surgical instruments and restraining devices that indicated the killer possessed equipment that would have been expensive and difficult to obtain, suggesting financial resources and connections that enabled him to acquire specialized tools for his work. The precision of the wounds inflicted on victims and the sophistication of the procedures they had undergone indicated training and experience that placed Cain far above the level of simple frontier violence. Most disturbing was the doctor's discovery of what appeared to be experimental notes hidden near several crime scenes, documents that suggested the killer was documenting his work with scientific rigor. These papers contained observations about victim responses to various stimuli, measurements of physiological changes during different stages of torture, and theoretical speculation about pain tolerance and psychological resilience that read like academic research conducted by someone whose field of study was human suffering. The autumn of 1892 brought the crime that would ultimately lead to Kane's downfall, though the cost of stopping him would prove almost as terrible as his continued freedom. Sarah McKinnon, the 16-year-old daughter of the Hollow's most prominent family, disappeared while returning from a visit to relatives in a neighboring valley. Unlike previous victims who had vanished without trace, Sarah managed to leave behind clues that finally provided investigators with insights into the killer's methods and hiding places. A piece of her dress caught on a thorn bush marked the beginning of a trail that led searchers deeper into the mountains than anyone had previously explored, following paths that seemed designed to confuse and disorient anyone who attempted to track them. The route led through terrain that appeared impassable, but revealed itself to be navigable by someone who possessed intimate knowledge of hidden caves and secret passages that honeycombed the limestone cliffs. The discovery of Kane's primary workshop came after 3 days of careful tracking, when searchers following Sarah's trail stumbled upon a cave system that had been converted into a laboratory that defied description through conventional language. The chambers contained equipment and instruments that would have been impressive in a major hospital, while the walls were lined with specimens and documentation that revealed the full scope of the killer's activities over the previous year. But it was the condition of Sarah McKinnon herself that provided the final proof of the monster that had been hiding among them. Found alive but barely recognizable as human, she had been subjected to procedures that seemed designed to explore the absolute limits of what a person could endure while remaining conscious. Her survival was later attributed to her youth and physical resilience, but the psychological damage she had suffered would prove to be permanent and devastating. Sarah's testimony, delivered in fragmentary whispers between periods of catatonic withdrawal, revealed details about Kane's methods and motivations that confirmed the worst fears of those who had studied his crimes. According to her account, the killer viewed his victims not as human beings, but as experimental subjects whose suffering provided data for research that he believed would advance human understanding of pain, fear, and the boundaries between life and death. The killer himself was found dead in the deepest chamber of his workshop, apparently having taken his own life rather than face capture and trial. But the circumstances of his death raised questions that investigators were never able to answer satisfactorily. Kane's body showed evidence of the same meticulous preparation that he had inflicted upon his victims, suggesting that his final act had been to apply his own methods to himself in some form of ultimate experiment. The chamber where Kane's body was discovered contained documentation that revealed the full extent of his activities, records that stretched back more than a decade and included references to crimes committed in locations throughout the eastern United States. The killer had apparently been traveling from community to community, perfecting his techniques through systematic experimentation on victims whose disappearances had never been connected to a single perpetrator. Most disturbing were the theoretical writings found among his papers, documents that attempted to justify his crimes through philosophical arguments about the nature of human experience and the value of suffering as a form of knowledge. Kane had apparently convinced himself that his activities represented legitimate scientific research that would ultimately benefit humanity by expanding understanding of human physical and psychological limits. As we uncover the full scope of this monster's activities, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that evil of this magnitude can exist undetected in any community. If these investigations into humanity's darkest chapters compel you to reflect on the vigilance required to protect the innocent, please consider leaving a like and subscribing for more explorations into the cases that history has tried to forget. The aftermath of Kane's discovery created a crisis for the community of Blackwood Creek that extended far beyond the immediate relief of his death. The evidence of his crimes was so extensive and disturbing that local authorities found themselves unable to process or investigate it through conventional legal channels. The systematic nature of his activities and the sophistication of his methods suggested connections to networks and institutions that small-town law enforcement was not equipped to pursue. The decision to suppress the case rather than pursue full investigation was made by a coalition of local officials, religious leaders, and prominent citizens who believed that public knowledge of Kane's crimes would cause more harm than justice would provide. The evidence was sealed and hidden, while official records were altered to eliminate references to the true scope of the killer's activities and the number of victims he had claimed. This conspiracy of silence was justified through arguments about protecting the community's reputation and preventing copycat crimes, but it also reflected a deeper reluctance to confront the implications of what Kane's activities revealed about human nature and the potential for evil that existed within any society. The systematic documentation of his crimes provided insights into the psychology of extreme violence that authorities found too disturbing to share with the public. The survivors of Kane's attacks, including Sarah McKinnon and several others who had escaped or been rescued before their final destruction, were relocated to distant institutions where they could receive specialized care while remaining isolated from contact with journalists or investigators who might seek to learn details about their experiences. The psychological damage they had suffered was so severe that most were never able to function independently or form normal relationships with other people. Dr. Webb, who had provided the most comprehensive professional assessment of the case, found his career effectively ended by his involvement in the investigation. His attempts to publish research based on his observations were blocked by medical authorities, who argued that such information could be used by other criminals to refine their own methods. The doctor eventually left the region entirely, relocating to a distant city where he practiced general medicine until his death, never again speaking publicly about what he had witnessed at Blackwood Creek. The physical evidence of Kane's activities was systematically destroyed or hidden in locations that were known only to a few individuals who took their secrets to their graves. The cave system where his workshop had been discovered was sealed with explosives, while his documentation and specimens were reportedly burned in ceremonies that resembled exorcisms more than evidence disposal. But despite these efforts to erase all traces of the butcher of Blackwood Creek, stories about his crimes persisted in oral traditions that were passed down through generations of mountain families who remembered the terror he had brought to their community. These accounts, shared only within trusted circles and never committed to writing, preserved details about his methods and victims that revealed the full scope of his activities. The geographical isolation that had enabled Kane's crimes also helped to contain knowledge about them, as the families who had suffered most directly from his predations rarely traveled beyond their immediate area or shared their experiences with outsiders. The hollow itself developed a reputation for being cursed or haunted that discouraged visitors and ensured that the community remained isolated from contact with investigators or journalists who might have pursued the truth about what had occurred there. Modern researchers who have attempted to study the case have encountered systematic resistance from local residents who maintain the conspiracy of silence that was established more than a century ago. Official records contain only fragmentary references to unexplained deaths and disappearances during the relevant period, while newspaper archives from the region show evidence of systematic editing that removed any mention of the crimes or their investigation. The few documents that survived the official suppression efforts provide tantalizing glimpses into the scope and nature of Kane's activities, but they raise more questions than they answer about his background, motivations, and the full extent of his crimes. References in surviving correspondence suggest that he may have been connected to medical or academic institutions that provided him with training and resources, while other evidence points to possible involvement with organizations that were conducting research into pain tolerance and psychological manipulation for military or intelligence purposes. The psychological profiles that were developed during the investigation described an individual whose intelligence and education far exceeded what would normally be found in such an isolated community, suggesting that Kane's presence in Blackwood Creek was not accidental, but part of a deliberate plan to establish a private laboratory where he could conduct experiments without oversight or interference. His choice of location demonstrated sophisticated understanding of geography, law enforcement capabilities, and social dynamics that enabled him to operate for years without detection. The Hollow's isolation, the close-knit nature of its community, and the absence of regular contact with outside authorities created ideal conditions for someone who required privacy and control to pursue activities that could not bear scrutiny. The religious and superstitious beliefs of the local population provided additional cover for his operations, as unexplained phenomena and mysterious disappearances were often attributed to supernatural causes rather than human agency. Kane appears to have deliberately cultivated these beliefs through the strategic placement of evidence and the timing of his activities to coincide with local folklore and seasonal traditions. The long-term effects of Kane's crimes extended far beyond their immediate victims, to poison the entire social fabric of the Blackwood Creek community. Families that had lived as neighbors for generations became suspicious and isolated, while traditional patterns of cooperation and mutual support broke down under the weight of fear and mistrust that his activities had created. The economic impact of the crimes was also severe, as the Hollow's reputation for harboring dangerous secrets discouraged trade and commerce with the outside world. Young people began leaving the area as soon as they reached adulthood, seeking opportunities in regions that were not associated with unspeakable horrors, while older residents remained trapped by circumstances and memories that prevented them from starting fresh elsewhere. The psychological trauma experienced by the entire community created patterns of behavior and belief that were passed down through generations, influencing the development of children who had not been born during Kane's reign of terror, but who inherited the fear and suspicion that his crimes had instilled in their parents and grandparents. Religious faith in the community was simultaneously strengthened and shaken by the experience of confronting such profound evil. While some residents found comfort in believing that divine intervention had ultimately ended Kane's activities, others struggled with questions about how a just God could permit such suffering to occur among innocent people who had lived according to Christian principles. The case of the butcher of Blackwood Creek represented one of the most systematic and thoroughly documented examples of extreme criminal behavior in American history, yet its official suppression has prevented it from contributing to academic understanding of serial violence and criminal psychology. The evidence that was gathered during the investigation could have provided insights into the development and motivations of extreme offenders that would have been valuable for preventing similar crimes in other locations. Instead, the conspiracy of silence that surrounded the case created a precedent for suppressing information about crimes that were considered too disturbing for public knowledge, establishing patterns of official secrecy that would be repeated in other cases involving extreme violence or unusual circumstances. The decision to prioritize community reputation over scientific understanding and criminal justice set a dangerous precedent that continued to influence law enforcement responses to extraordinary crimes. The modern era has seen periodic attempts to revisit the case through academic research and investigative journalism, but these efforts have consistently encountered resistance from government agencies that maintain classification of documents related to the investigation. The official position is that release of information about Kane's methods could provide inspiration or instruction for potential criminals, though critics argue that this explanation conceals embarrassment about the failure of law enforcement and the arbitrary nature of the suppression decision. Independent researchers who have attempted to gather information through interviews with elderly residents of the region have found that most families still refuse to discuss the case, maintaining the code of silence that was established by their ancestors more than a century ago. The few individuals who have been willing to share information have provided accounts that suggest the official suppression covered up evidence of connections between Kane and institutions or organizations that authorities preferred not to acknowledge. The legacy of the butcher of Blackwood Creek serves as a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who combine intelligence and education with complete absence of moral constraint, individuals who can use their knowledge and skills to commit atrocities that transcend normal categories of criminal behavior. Kane's case demonstrated how isolation and secrecy could enable such individuals to operate for extended periods while developing and refining their methods through systematic experimentation. The suppression of his case also illustrates the dangers inherent in allowing authorities to decide which information the public should be permitted to know, particularly when those decisions are based on subjective judgments about what communities can handle rather than objective assessments of public interest and safety. The precedent established at Blackwood Creek contributed to patterns of official secrecy that have continued to undermine transparency and accountability in criminal justice. As we conclude this investigation into one of history's most disturbing and deliberately forgotten cases, we must confront the uncomfortable reality that monsters like Ezekiel Cain have walked among us throughout human history, protected by the very civilized sensibilities that their crimes violate. The story of the Butcher of Blackwood Creek reminds us that evil of this magnitude requires not just individual depravity, but systemic failures that enable it to flourish undetected. The hollow where these crimes occurred remains largely uninhabited to this day, its reputation for harboring dark secrets having proved more enduring than efforts to suppress knowledge about what actually happened there. The creek still runs dark between its limestone walls, carrying with it the memory of horrors that official history refuses to acknowledge, but which oral tradition ensures will never be completely forgotten. The true horror of Cain's story lies not just in the specific atrocities he committed, but in the demonstration of how completely the pursuit of knowledge without moral constraint can corrupt human nature and transform intelligence into an instrument of unprecedented cruelty. His case serves as an eternal warning that some forms of curiosity should never be indulged and some experiments should never be conducted, regardless of what they might reveal about the nature of human experience. The conspiracy of silence that has surrounded the case for more than a century ultimately serves not justice or public safety, but the comfortable illusion that such monsters do not exist among us. The suppression of truth, however noble its intentions, creates dangers that may ultimately prove more destructive than the knowledge it seeks to contain. The Butcher of Blackwood Creek may be dead, but the conditions that enabled his crimes and the attitudes that led to their suppression continue to threaten any community that values secrecy over truth and reputation over justice. In the end, the most disturbing aspect of this case may not be the crimes themselves, but the systematic effort to erase them from history, denying future generations the opportunity to learn from one of humanity's darkest chapters. The blood that stained the waters of Blackwood Creek has long since washed away, but the secrets buried in its depths continue to poison our understanding of human nature and our ability to confront the evil that walks among us, disguised as ordinary neighbors and trusted community members.